All right. So we are starting today our next Eastern religious tradition and philosophical tradition, which is Buddhism. So I want to give everyone any last chances to talk about Hinduism. Of course, we're going to be making a lot of comparisons because Buddhism is one of the many schools of Hinduism. Okay, so let's do last remaining questions about Hinduism. All right, so we're going to do rapid fire quick test then. Hindu metaphysics, what do we call the ultimate reality? Ultimate reality in Hindu metaphysics. Sean, you know what it is? Do you remember how to pronounce? Brahman, very everyone's trying to remember to spell it. Okay. Brahman. Good. Okay, the ultimate reality. What is the true self, your immortal soul in Hindu metaphysics? What do we call that? Atman, very good, Sean. Okay, so these are going to be the primary things that are not acknowledged to exist in the Buddhist tradition. And this is going to come directly from the experience of Siddhartha Gautama. Who's Siddhartha Gautama? Who's the Buddha. That's right. The Buddha. That's right. Good. Because Buddha just means enlightened one. So there are going to have been, there have been many Buddhas, right, in the history of the Buddhist tradition. But the Buddha refers to Gautama Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama. Okay. So this refers to the first individual to believed to have achieved this type of enlightenment. And so, enlightenment in Hinduism, right? So, going back a little bit, enlightenment in Hinduism meant being released from Maya, right? Being released from the cycle of samsara, of death and rebirth, no longer being reborn, no longer having to deal with karma, right? Or reincarnation or anything like this. And then you are released from samsara and you are rejoining Brahman. But there's no Brahman, right? In Buddhism. So, one of the interesting things that we're going to see is how that metaphysical picture differs. Okay, so this individual who is said to have achieved enlightenment, when he goes through that process, and we'll talk about what that looked like for him, he was doing that inward seeking and he did not experience an Atman. He did not experience a true self. Does anyone know what Siddhartha experienced when he looked inward? Maybe you've done a little bit of the reading. Maybe you've seen that awful movie with Keanu Reeves where he plays him. Unfortunately, historically accurate in terms of the mythology. But you got to overlook the blackface a little bit. Nirvana, very good, Victor. Okay, so nirvana is the word for enlightenment in Buddhism, but we have to figure out what that means, right? Because there will be no Brahman to be rejoined, right? You don't have an Atman. So even what was being reborn in the first place, right? So we have all of these sort of questions that we have to ask. All right, so since we are going to be spending 2 weeks on Buddhism, I'm going to do something I don't normally do, which is spend some time lecturing over the content just because there are so many details and we have got the time to go through it, right? So we have today and Thursday to start our section on Buddhism. So today I want to get you familiarized with Siddhartha Gautama's story. And then on Thursday, I'm going to start introducing the different branches, which we're going to really dive into next week. Next week, we'll wrap up by getting into the nitty gritty, many different branches of Buddhism, which is fun because that's when we get into Zen Buddhism and some of the, fun paradoxes that are meant to try to bring about nirvana in a sort of spontaneous sort of way. So some of you might have heard of some of these, like what is the sound of one hand clapping, right? That's a particular koan that's used in Zen Buddhism. So we're going to talk about that next week, but we're going to spend this week just getting an introduction, right, to the life of this individual, because again, he's coming from the tradition we just spent 2 weeks talking about, right? So that's his upbringing. So any questions? Enlightenment with Kurt. Yes, I know. So many good Nirvana references, I'm sure. All right. So I'm going to share my screen. We will get going. Any questions before I get started? Okay. Screen's going here. All right. So one of the ways in which Buddhism is already going to differ from Hinduism, and this is again one of the reasons why we go in the order that we do, is we're going chronologically. So Hinduism, if you recall, the oldest set of texts, the Vedas, were not seen as having a date of origin, right? They were seen as an eternal sort of text. And so that's why we cover that tradition first. It doesn't even have a date of origin or a founder or anything like this, right? So it's a religion that it views itself as having always existed. Whereas the traditions that come from here on out are all going to be associated with a specific figure, right? A person, a historical figure, and thus a specific time, right, in history. So I did see, in general, was the Buddha ostracized for his beliefs back in the day? So what's interesting is he wasn't so much ostracized as he elected to remove himself from the prominent Hindu tradition. And we're going to talk about exactly why he does that. Good. So he ended up, after he achieves enlightenment, he ends up being a wandering teacher, which is again something that is going to become very common as this tradition moves over into China. And then we start seeing Chinese philosophical traditions emerge, right? This idea of just sort of that was your job as you kind of walked around and you were, today we would probably call them like a guru, right? In the Hindu tradition or something like this, or a yogi, right? But a teacher, someone that you go to, but they're traveling teachers instead of having a set classroom. And what's also interesting about one of the differences between Buddhism and Hinduism is that we're going to see that Buddhism has been exported over larger swaths of the world than Hinduism has. And so we're going to see, again, a lot of variety, especially as it starts to merge with other religious traditions, right? So Hinduism had such variety already. It has had such a long history and has evolved in so many different ways, right? We already saw elements of polytheism and monotheism, right? And panentheism, right? Different views of the divine. Okay. The idea is that it doesn't even have much more to change as it moves throughout the world. But Buddhism, you're going to see that every time it sort of moves to a different part of the world, it absorbs whatever the dominant tradition of that place is and incorporates it into the tradition in unique ways, right? So that's why there's going to be so many nitty-gritty details to get into. But again, just to cover the main things that we want to note in terms of Buddhism as being one of the many offshoots of Hinduism is that when we're looking at the metaphysical picture, right, both of them maintain the bottom part of the metaphysics, right? The things that are ascribed to Maya. Now, when it comes to personal identity, they're going to have different names for things, right? So we talked about the tripartite soul in Hinduism and the 3 gunas that ruled over, right, the soul. We're going to have a different sort of breakdown in the Buddhist conception of the self. And so there's going to be 5, what are called skandhas. And so it's going to be a different sort of conception there. And so different verbiage, right? But the main idea is that Maya, samsara, karma, all of that is the same, just without an Atman, right? Without an immortal soul being passed around. And so we're going to have to see how the cycle of reincarnation works in Buddhism if there's nothing actually being transferred. Okay, so again, the differences here were originating from a single source, not going to be acknowledging the authority of the Vedic texts, which makes it one of the non-orthodox schools of Hinduism. Also doesn't acknowledge the Hindu pantheon, right? Because it's denying that ultimate reality, hence all the gods that go along with it. But of course, you might be saying to yourself, well, there are gods in Buddhism. Again, that's going to be a much later type of Buddhism that has incorporated probably like local deities or deified Siddhartha Gautama over time, right? But the origins of the Buddhist tradition are in fact atheistic, right? They do not maintain the existence of anything that reflects or represents our notions of divinity. Okay, so no pantheon. And then obviously the Vedas were about rituals in order to achieve that enlightenment, right? So obviously that's not going to work because they're going to have a very different picture because of this, right? There is no self. And we're going to see why the Buddha thought that. And as a result, right, enlightenment is going to have to look different. Okay, so moksha in Hinduism was being released from samsara and being reabsorbed into Brahman. But there is no Atman that's getting released, and there is no Brahman to be reabsorbed to. So enlightenment in Buddhism, or nirvana, is going to mean something very different. Okay, so again, this is just a much older, less sophisticated version of that infographic I have on my website, right, where we can split our metaphysics historically, right? But in Buddhism, we're just going to have the one unified whole. Okay, so no, we're going to be replacing Brahman, we're going to be replacing Atman, and instead of Atman, they're going to have Anatman, or in Pali, Anatta, which is no true self or not self, which I want to make a distinction here. Not self is not the same as there being no self. Anyone think they can gather just from what they have understood so far, or maybe what you know about Buddhism already? What do you think the difference is between saying not self and no self? What might no self mean? No soul, which is what the Buddhists are saying. So why don't they call it no self? Because they're not saying that you don't exist, right? So that's actually going to be, so that's one thing we got from Hinduism, right? That everyone's Atman was the same. But since we don't have an Atman, we can't say that there's a oneness to everything. Instead, yourself is empty. And what they mean by that is empty of anything permanent, just like everything else, right? So this thing you call the self, there's nothing permanent within that thing. According to the Buddhists, there are only 5 temporary things that make up your conception of the self, and they basically end up mapping onto something like the 5 senses, and then a model of how that results in consciousness, right? But the idea is that because it's all rooted in the physical body, as soon as the physical body disintegrates upon death, so too does yourself, right? Your notion of a self. So it's not that there's no self, right? Obviously there's stuff. There is stuff, and it's not empty of meaning, right? We can bestow meaning on all these things, and the meaning can be varied because they're changing all the time, right? Our bodies are changing all the time because of its temporary nature. So it's just empty of permanence, right? So when they're saying not self, we're just saying that the thing that you think of as yourself, your sense of ego, consciousness, or self, is just a bundle of temporary things. And so our textbook is going to do a good job of connecting this with David Hume's bundle theory, right? And so this is again an analog in Western philosophy about, right, the nature of reality. That when it comes to things that exist, right, and knowledge of them, right, if you are an empiricist, you think that knowledge only comes from experience. And Siddhartha Gautama became an empiricist, and he became an empiricist as a result of his life, right? And specifically what he experienced when he was trying to achieve enlightenment according to the Hindu paths and ended up choosing a different path. Okay, I'm trying to go back. There we go. All right. So let's talk about his story now. So not unfamiliar, right? We're going to see in a lot of these Eastern traditions very miraculous birth stories. Some of the details are going to be similar to details that might sound familiar to you in later Abrahamic traditions. If any of you are familiar with the history of religion, you know that these aren't even the first versions of these. We have analogs to them in ancient Egyptian mythologies as well. So, right, these stories are not new. So we might ask ourselves, right, what these different details are meant to represent or to symbolize. Okay, so Siddhartha, as his name, means he who has reached his goal. So almost a sort of premonition, right, about enlightenment in this case. Again, born to actually very privileged circumstances, which is going to be really interesting because one of the things that's going to set Buddhism apart from Hinduism specifically is Siddhartha Gautama's rejection of the caste system, right? So he came from this life of prestige, yet ends up advocating for something that would very much go against that, right? So we want to understand why that is. But again, his birth story is that his mother was one of many wives, right? So kings at this time would have had a number of wives. They would have been practicing polygamy. This is very common in the ancient world. We're going to see this in most of the religions that follow as well, including the Abrahamic ones. And obviously, in this case, it's definitely a measure of status and privilege. But we're also going to see that it ends up being a sort of pragmatic solution to men who die in the war, right? The idea is that then they leave behind potentially wives and children who need looking after. And so the idea is that like a male family member would marry them to take care of them. So lots of different justifications for this, right? But Siddhartha Gautama's mother was, again, one of many. Now, she is not going to be seen as having a virgin birth, like we're going to see in the story of Jesus's birth in Christianity. Not in this class because it's Eastern philosophy, but if you were to continue to study religions. It is said, it is supposed to have been the result of immaculate conception. So immaculate conception doesn't require virginity, but it's any time a child is conceived outside of the result of sexual intercourse, right? So again, we might have different explanations for how we might see this to be the case, but the idea is that she was a recent wife of the king, and so they had not been able to, what's the word? When you consummate the marriage, right? Yeah, consummate. So they had not yet consummated the marriage, yet he ended up being born. He also is said to have had a very unusual birth story in that his mother was outside in the palace premises when she gave birth. And again, we're going to see the significance of a Bodhi tree, or what we would call today a fig tree, in this story, as well as in his enlightenment story, right? So there's going to be an interesting callback to his mother with regards to his enlightenment, which we might think is important in terms of, women's role in the religious tradition, but that's another question, right? But women are going to play a very important story in his life and his achieving enlightenment. So as she is going into labor, it is said that the Bodhi tree, bent down its branch in order to aid her, right? Sort of like nature was coming to provide support. So again, whether or not we take this literally, we might see it as a sign of the significance of this individual and the life that they're going to have. Right? So again, lots of prophecies around his birth, very similar to other traditions that we've seen. So again, he ends up living this life, of course, like any prince would, of great privilege, wealth, and luxury. But part of that means that he is not shown a number of things about the world. Specifically, his father tries to keep from him 3 truths about the world: old age, sickness, and death, meaning that Siddhartha Gautama grew up without any old people around him, without any ill people around him, and was never allowed to witness death, right? So talk about a privileged, right, rose-colored glasses way of seeing the world. So when he achieves a certain level, here, I'll stop sharing so I don't give spoilers. Once he reaches a certain age, I think it's his early 20s or maybe 18 when he first starts to question this, but he finally is able to negotiate leaving the palace, right? Because you can't really keep up this illusion out in the real world. Only in a very, controlled environment could one maintain this illusion for decades. So he ends up going out, he has this big parade, and of course the whole parade route is, very carefully cultivated so that it maintains the illusion, right? So they've cleaned the streets, they've, moved the dead bodies, they've, isolated the sick people and all this sort of thing. And Siddhartha Gautama is like, oh, okay. And then he sort of looks down an alleyway and sees, what looks like a very dirty, person. So he sort of is curious and he follows, and then he sees the real world, right? He sees the destitute reality that most people are living in. He sees that regardless of how much, gold and silver you might have, eventually he too will die, right? This ends up being the conclusion of his observations in the world. Now, some people, of course, are trying to use their wealth to make sure that they live forever. But the lesson that he got from it was that, we shouldn't be attaching ourselves to these things that are, in the end, meaningless, right? If you're going to die no matter what, then why spend our lives, right, struggling so much to constantly, satisfy every single desire that we have? So he sort of has this radical switch. He goes from living a life of extreme privilege to totally abandoning that world, which included a wife and a son. I mean, he left them in the palace, so they were well cared for, at least in terms of basic survival needs. And he left. And so he decided to go and seek enlightenment in the Hindu tradition, right? That was what he was immersed in. And so he mastered the various paths, right? Including asceticism. Does anyone know what asceticism is? If you are an ascetic lifestyle. Very good, Joseph. To deprive oneself, right? So to deprive oneself specifically of all physical pleasures, right? So individuals who live an ascetic lifestyle take vows of poverty. They are usually unhoused by choice. They will only survive off of the barest minimum of nutrients, right, in terms of food and water. And right, they're doing this as part of their spiritual commitment to achieving enlightenment. Now, how in the Hindu tradition, how might depriving yourself of physical pleasures lead to moksha? Very good, right? You're training yourself to not depend on these things so much, right? To not be constantly attaching ourselves. I mean, look at how much stuff we all have around us, right? We all have way more than we need, and still people freak out when something happens to their stuff, right? Like, we are constantly attached to our things. And so by training yourself, by intentionally depriving yourself of those things, the idea is that you will lose that attachment. You won't need to feel attached to them anymore. Thus, you won't suffer as much and then become closer to enlightenment. Very good. Okay, so the Buddha masters all of these techniques while he is out and about trying to achieve enlightenment, and trying to overcome this sort of struggle that he's dealing with. He sees there being sort of two options. If everything in this Maya, right, is temporary, well, then you can either try to hold on to things for as long as possible, but of course, even as Hinduism said, that's going to just result in suffering. Or you should look for something permanent, right? Something that will not die. So that's what he does, right? And Hinduism tells him that Brahman and Atman are there for him to discover. And so he is having these experiences, and he ends up becoming an extreme ascetic, which is why if you see statues or images of the early Buddha, he's not that very jolly fat man. He's quite thin. I have here, I won't be doing any spoilers now. So I can share my screen again. He was very, very thin. You can see his rib cage, right? And this is representing the moment in his life right before he achieved enlightenment. So he was, eating and drinking the absolute bare minimum. And the story goes that he ends up passing out, right? Of course, under the extreme heat. And then he has a vision of his mother, and then who tells him to take the middle way. And so if he is coming from this life of privilege and he's practicing asceticism, what is the middle way? Yes, but what is in between them? The middle, what is it? Balance. Good, good. Not too much, not too little, right? So yeah, we also might call this moderation, right? Have you ever heard anyone say everything in moderation? That's very much accurate of the Buddhist middle way, okay? So the idea is that the right thing, the ethics of Buddhism, as it were, is going to be found in the middle, right? Not any sort of extreme, okay? So if anything you're doing in life is at one of those extremes, it's not going to be the virtuous thing to do, right? The middle path is going to be the one that leads to enlightenment. And he recognizes this as a result of there's a young girl who ends up approaching him and giving him some rice, so he eats it, and then he finds some shade, right? So already indulging his physical comfort a little bit more, right? So he's not on the brink of death. And so he moves under the shade of a Bodhi tree, and he ends up having this intense experience. I'm now inclined to play the scene from that movie I was telling you about. I want to apologize ahead of time for Keanu Reeves, but it is, again, accurate to the mythology of what is said to have occurred when Siddhartha Gautama achieved enlightenment. So I'm going to play that for us really quick. He was heterosexual. I don't know anything about the Buddha's sexuality, right? Assuming he was, right? Then having a bunch of beautiful women around might tempt him to indulge in those physical pleasures even more, right? Than just getting shade and having more to eat than is necessary to survive. Right? But again, he saw past it. He saw how temporary these types of things are. Okay, and so then there's thunder and lightning and war, and this is meant to represent, lots of things that might scare him into just retreating from the path that he's on, right? Not getting any closer to the truth. And then the final test is the one that's most important. What was the deal with him pulling his own reflection out of the water and then it becoming Mara? What was that? Think back to Hinduism. What was that reflection supposed to be? His self, his true self. That was the illusion of an Atman, right? So he says, Lord of my ego, right? So the desire to have a permanent self, a permanent soul that will live on forever, that is the final and biggest source of our suffering, right? Most suffering, that makes sense, right? The biggest source of our suffering, that particular attachment, right? The one we have to any notion of an immortal soul, right? So that's the final test. And then recognizing that too is just a desire. It's just a product of what we might today call wishful thinking, right? Because when he looked inward, again, he did not experience an immortal self. He only experienced the 5 skandhas, which we'll talk about. But again, basically those pretty much map on to something like the 5 senses, right? And he recognized that all of those come from the physical body. And so if the physical body were to cease, then everything that arises from that would cease as well. So any questions about this moment of enlightenment? Why he is rejecting that upper metaphysical part, right? It's a direct result of this one experience. No? Okay, so here's where it gets a little confusing. Because again, part of our picture in Maya is still the cycle of reincarnation. So on the one hand, the Buddha doesn't talk about things like an afterlife because he hasn't experienced an afterlife, right? He's not going to talk about Brahman or Atman, right? Because he didn't experience those things. He's going to, in fact, reject them because that's what he has experienced, the lack thereof. And what's very strange, though, is he does have, or claim to have, access to the memories of his past lives. But his, right, we don't want to put the quotes because he's not going to be possessing them. But memories of past lives. So the question then for us is, how can reincarnation work, right? How can he have access to past lives if there's no soul that's being transferred, right, from one to the other? But before we get into that, right, we will finish up his life story. Right. So after he made this discovery, he then returned home to tell them, right, what he had discovered, and was gathering followers to create or to join what is called a sangha. That is the monastic community, the community of monks and nuns. And there's going to be some interesting things about, whether or not he let women join. But the basic idea, again, is that he saw this is one of only 2 options, right, when faced with the reality of the world. Since everyone is liable to these 3 truths, right? You're liable to sickness, you're liable to suffer, right? You're liable to old age and death. You can either attach to those things, right? Try as hard as you can to make them last as long as possible. And again, just look at the plastic surgery culture, right? Aging, right? There's so much ageism that it puts pressure on people to try to hold on to their youth forever, right? Again, talking about billionaires trying to achieve immortality, right? They're engaging what the Buddha would call the ignoble quest, right? Not the noble quest. They're trying to attach to things that are inevitably impermanent, right? That will inevitably cease to exist. The noble quest, right, again, is to look for something else. But since that's not Atman, we have to figure out what that is, right? And it's going to be something about pursuing this path of moderation. Okay, so after mastering all the techniques, again, it's not going to be found in one extreme or the other. And so again, we might see this as being in contradiction with other, ethical principles that we get from other religious traditions. Something that's super prominent in the world today is something called the prosperity gospel, right? Where your wealth and success is seen as a direct result of how much God loves you or something like this, right? Or how worthy you are of God's love. Okay, that is the exact opposite of this, okay? That all of those things are empty, right? They're just temporary, totally impermanent. And so the best way to achieve a life that is in line with this path of moderation is to follow the 3 jewels, right? To follow the life of the Buddha, right? Study his teachings. And that's best done, it is believed by most branches of Buddhism, in the Sangha, right? Joining the community. So you can officially become a monk or a nun, or you might be what we call a lay person, right? Which is someone who practices Buddhism, but does not live in the monastery and does not practice, the daily types of rituals that monks and nuns would, but they often will volunteer their time and material goods to support the monastic community. So anyone who lives in a monastery, you'll notice that all of the food, everything that they consume is donated. And so it would be the lay people, right, who support them in that way, even helping with cooking and things like this. I got to spend some time at a Buddhist monastery in Taiwan, so I'm happy to share any of my experiences. It was a fascinating 3 days. All right, so getting back to this unique Buddhist metaphysics, right? How do we make sense of Maya now, given that there's no Atman, right? Well, again, they're still going to have many different views of realms, possible realms to be reborn into. But again, what is being reborn, right? Because this impermanence is a pervasive feature of the universe, and it's specifically called the doctrine of dependent arising. But really, again, you could sort of think of it like that saying, you can't step into the same river twice, right? Because whatever the river was constituted of the first time you dipped your toe in, right? The water is different, the soil underneath, everything about it is different than the second before, right? So again, it's not really the same river, same idea of us, right? Anything that you'd be able to identify about yourself at one point didn't exist, even while you were alive, right? Things you might use to describe yourself now probably wouldn't describe you when you were a child and may not describe you in the future, right? And they certainly will describe us once our physical bodies cease to exist, right? So all of that holds true, leading to what are known as the 3 marks of existence, right? So this is just getting more detailed in that metaphysical picture of Maya, right? So if it's all permanent, what can we say about it? Well, everything that exists in Buddhism has these 3 marks, right? The first one obviously is that impermanence. The second is that life is suffering because we attach ourselves to the impermanent. But what's important to understand about suffering, and we'll elaborate on this more, is that not every moment of life is suffering, right? It just means that to exist, at least in terms of sentience, that's not a word that Buddhists would use, but it's important for us to distinguish between like plant life or human and animal life. So sentience is the ability to experience pain or pleasure, right? So you have to have some sort of central nervous system from what we currently understand, right? Biologically speaking. But so any sentient form of existence, right, is going to be marked by suffering. But one could even say that even a plant suffers, right? It can suffer for lack of nutrients. It can suffer for poor environmental circumstances or care. I mean, we could just stomp on it or right, like there's so many ways in which a plant, and again, it might not suffer in the same ways, but certainly like there's something negative seems to be happening to its quality of existence. Okay, so again, that suffering is inevitable, and that nothing can exist permanently in whatever ideal state we might want. Right, to exist, I mean, you can't live without, I don't know, stubbing your toe or feeling some negative emotion. And then finally, as a result of these 2 things, right, the 3rd mark is the not self, that because all of these things are impermanent, so too are you, right? There is no Atman. This leads to the 4 Noble Truths. So this is how the Buddha moves from his metaphysics to his epistemology, right? So because life is suffering and we've identified the origin of that suffering, which is attachment, right? Specifically attachment to our Atman. Then, of course, follows the second 2, that, of course, we can overcome this suffering by detaching from that thing, specifically, again, detaching from a commitment to a permanent self. And so replacing that, right, again, how do we constitute our metaphysical picture? Well, instead of there being an Atman to move between lives, we can reinterpret karma as something more like cause and effect, right? Because one of the issues is that, again, karma is understood as a law of cosmic justice. But if there is no Atman, if there is no immortal soul, then how is it fair for this body that you're in, that is existing now, and I'm trying not to use you and possessive words, this body that is existing now, that is sentient, how is it fair that that body has to suffer the consequences of actions that it wasn't responsible for, right? That were responsible by other entities other than itself. Okay, and so it calls into question, right, the fairness of the universe. And Buddhism sort of leans into that, right? And so we're going to end today with just a little allegory, which is going to start becoming more and more prevalent for us, especially as we move into Chinese traditions. So these are going to be stories that offer some sort of symbolism, right, for the things that we're talking about, usually involving animals. And so this story is about two monkeys. Okay, so they're hanging out on the beach with coconut palm trees. And one of the monkeys is throwing coconuts, just standing on the beach, throwing coconuts, throwing coconuts, throwing coconuts. The other monkey walks by and starts getting hit by the coconuts. And he's like, dude, what the F? Like, why are you hitting me with the coconuts? And the first monkey's like, I'm just throwing coconuts. You don't have to stand there. So which monkey do we think is going to be representative of karma in this case? The monkey getting hit by the coconuts or the monkey throwing the coconuts? Ahmad says getting hit. Both. Both. Joseph, you're right. It's the throwing of the coconut, right? The throwing of the coconut is the karma. You can't control the monkey throwing the coconut, right? But what you can control is what you do in the face of that experience, right? And the idea is, again, empirically, this is supposed to just be an accurate representation of the world we live in, right? You do have to deal with the consequences of other people's choices, right? Choices that had nothing to do with it, that you are not responsible for. And sometimes you have to suffer the consequences of those. But that doesn't mean you can't do anything to change it, right? So it's a way of sort of accepting, right, the circumstances that you find yourself in, while acknowledging some level of control over the physical body that you have as to whether or not you continue to suffer from that karma or not. All right, so that leads us at the end of class. So ruminate on those monkeys, see which coconuts you can step out of the way of. All right, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you on Thursday. Feel free to hang out if you have any questions.